Welcome to this second session on our review of CRS216. In the previous session, we have actually focused on nouns, and in this section, we will start our focus on the verbs. Now, because the verbs are so many, we will be breaking this session into two, and we will start with the indicative verbs. And in fact, we will be looking at almost every aspect of verb under the indicative mood, beginning from the present and active indicative verbs to the passive, to the middle, to the imperfect, and even to the future aorist. But we will need to break it into two, and this we will do very soon. I am Olubi Adewale, your facilitator for this session, and I welcome you into this session on Greek verbs. Let's go on. Welcome to this session. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, you are welcome back to class. This is the session on indicative verbs, and you'll see our logo here, which is just showing you Luo in all the various ways in which it could be expressed, and there are many. I just put that there, and that's something you can just maybe look through and give you an easy beginning or easy remembrance or tingling of your memory. All right. Second session on our review. The intended learning outcomes of this session is to make sure that you're able to write any indicative verb in any form, in any voice. View of CRS2. Now, the present active indicative, for your memory, remember that this is the tense of a verb carries two aspects, and this is the time of the action and the kind of the action. When we are talking about the time of action, we are talking about three possibilities: the past, the present, and the future. And when we are talking about the kind of action, we are talking about two types: the linear, which is also called the progressive action, or the continuous action. And then we are talking again about the punctiliar, an action that is seen as a single perspective. Now, the present tense indicates a progressive action at the present time. Now, in this table, we are bringing to your memory the present active indicative form of luo. Remember that luo is your first person singular. I lose, and the plural is luomen, we lose. Then the second person singular is luais, you lose, and the plural luete, you lose. The third person is luai, that's he or she or it, lose. And then the third person is luosi or luosin. That no is in bracket because sometimes they may not appear like that. In the previous session, we have... in the passive voice, it becomes luomai, lue, luetai, luometha, lueste, luontai. And remember, in the passive, the subject receives the action. So, for example, luomai is I am being loosed. So it's still the subject that is experiencing the actually focus on. Now, in the passive voice, there are four ways in which the passive voice can be used. Four ways. One, the passive voice could be used when the direct agent is mentioned. And to do this, upo, a preposition, in the genitive case is used. Now, an example here is the dasketai upo tu angelu. Translation, he is being thought by the messenger. So the emphasis is on by the messenger in that place. Now, it could be the indirect agents. And in this case, dia will be the preposition, and the case will also be genitive. And example here is all cosmos egeneto diautu, which translation will mean the world was made through him. So through him there is the indirect agent. Now, the agent can be impersonal, that is, it may not be a human being. And when this is the case, dative is used and it may carry preposition en or not. An example here is oi anthropoi sozontai ento logo tu mesieu, which means the men are being saved by the word of the Messiah. And finally, there are cases when an agent will not be expressed. For example, egeritai is one word and it means he is being raised up. No agent is mentioned. Nouns and the present middle indicative. English language does not have this construction, and in the middle voice, the subject is acting in such a way that it participates in the result of the action. The subject and not the action is the focal point. Now, the middle voice in the Greek language is used in three different ways. It could be used reflexively, intensively, or reciprocally. In this section, we will start about. Now, let's look at the reflexive middle, which is the basic idea of the middle voice. In that case, the result of the action comes back directly to the agent. Now let's look at this beautiful example. O anthropos egeretai, which means the man is raising himself up. He is raising himself up. Focus on the verbs. Intensive middle, which stresses the agent that is producing the action rather than its participation in the action. Again, example here is the dasketai then alithian, which means he is teaching the truth. The emphasis here is on he. Now, because the verbs are so, the reciprocal middle actually occurs only in the plural subject engaged in an interchange of action. For example, oi anthropoi didaskontai. The men are teaching one another. Teaching one another. Now, in terms of form, that in terms of spelling, there is no difference between the passive voice and the middle voice. Many. We will be breaking. You discover that it is the same thing we have seen in the passive. Luomai, lue, luetai, luometha, lueste, luontai. Now, in this session into two. Here, we are going to take a pause. I'm going to ask you to take a pause as you are listening to this video. Take out a sheet of paper, write 10 Greek words for yourself, and write out all the present active and present passive in all the persons. In other words, first person, second person, third person, singular, first person, second person, third person, plural. That's going to jog your memory. That's going to help you to recover fast what you have learned in 215. Now let's go on. And we'll start with the imperfect indicative. Now the imperfect indicative verb is used in Greek language to express the continuous action in the past time. Continuous action in the past time. Now take note of the changes in the translation and compare this with the present indicative tense on your own. Now, the imperfect active of luo will be translated, I was losing. In other words, my losing was in the past time. There are three major usages of the indicative verbs, and that is called descriptive imperfect. It is used to give a vivid representation of what was going on in past time, and it usually draws a picture of the movement of events. And a good example we are using here is Matthew 3, I think this is verse 6, or anyway, between 5 to 6. Now the verse of the sentence says, then Jerusalem was going out. The Greek word there is exeporeto, going out to him. And they were being baptized. The Greek word there is a baptizonto in the Jordan River. Now, in that sentence, exeporeto is an imperfect active, while a baptizonto is an imperfect middle. Now, so you could see the significance of this word vividly. Now, we have the repeated or iterative imperfects. This is used to show actions that are repeated in the past time. It usually represents an action that is done repeatedly, as in Acts chapter 1 verse 7. Now let's look at that. They were asking him, the Greek word there is legontes. Lord, art thou at this time restoring the kingdom to Israel? So you can actually rephrase that as they kept on asking him, which implies that they have asked Jesus this same question before and it is being repeated. Looking at almost every aspect of. Then the inceptive imperfect, which pictures continuous action in the past while laying emphasis on the beginning of the action. Edidas Ken in Luke 5:3 and Mark 5:37 is an example. And the correct translation should have been, he began teaching them. Though most translations translate and he taught them. But the literal translation is he began teaching them. Verb under the. Now, one thing you will notice in the imperfect is the use of le epsilon before most of the words that began with consonants. This letter is called an augment. In Greek, this augment is an indication that the word is a secondary tense. A secondary tense in Greek expresses a past time. Now, when you are bringing a vowel before a word beginning with a consonant, it is called a syllabic augment because that vowel is a syllable on its own. Remember what we have learned under the rules of syllabification. Now, with the words beginning with vowels, that vowel will be heightened to the next corresponding long vowel, and that is called temporal augment. Now, in temporal augment, epsilon becomes eta, omicron becomes omega, alpha becomes eta for differentiation, because if you retain alpha, you will not know whether it is a long alpha or a short alpha. An example here is akuo, which will become a kuon, and a gyro, which will become a gyron. Mood, beginning. Now, the imperfect active indicative in compound verbs. Remember, compound verbs are verbs that have preposition coming before the vowel. Before the verb. Now, if the preposition ends with a vowel, elision will take place. Now, let's look at this. Ekbalo. Now, you have to bring the augment epsilon before balo, and you now have exebalon. Exebalon. Later, you will understand why this became xi. Now, in apoktaino, we now have apektinon. This omicron has to be ellipted to give way for the epsilon. Apago becomes apagon. This alpha also has from the present. Now, IME form of the imperfect active indicative. You remember the IME form is our verb to be. Now we have a man, I was, a man, we were, is, you were, it, you were, and he or she or it was, and a son, they were. Active indicative verbs to Now, the imperfect middle of lo will now read eluomen, eluo, elueto, eluometha, elueste, eluonto. Now, just make sure passive to the game, and we are taking the next class activity, which will bring us to the end of this session, and that's you take another 10 Greek words and read them out in the imperfect active, both in the present, in the middle voice and in the active voice. So thank you for listening. Make sure you do all these activities so that your understanding will be broadened. Bye for now. The middle to the imperfect. And even to the future areas, but we need to break it into two, and this we will do very soon. I am Olubi Adewale, your facilitator for this session, and I welcome you into this session on Greek verbs.